The October air in downtown Chicago carried a crisp edge as the sun dipped behind the skyline, painting Michigan Avenue in shades of amber and steel. Inside La Rosa d'Oro, an upscale Italian-American restaurant nestled between towering corporate buildings, the atmosphere was a carefully curated blend of old-world charm and modern elegance. Vintage fixtures hung from exposed brick walls, casting warm golden light across dark mahogany tables draped in pristine white linen, ornamental wall decorations, framed black and white photographs of Sicily, copper pots suspended from wooden beams, and a hand-painted mural depicting the Amalfi Coast, transformed the space into something that felt both authentic and aspirational. The evening shift had just begun when three men arrived without a reservation, their tailored suits and confident strides announcing their presence before they spoke. Marcus Whitfield entered first, his salt and pepper hair perfectly styled, a Rolex catching the light as he gestured dismissively toward the hostess stand. Behind him, Bradley Sutton adjusted his silk tie, his sharp features set in an expression of practiced indifference. The third man, Jonathan Pierce, checked his phone with barely concealed impatience, his designer shoes clicking against the restaurant's geometric mosaic floor. Lisa Martinez had been wiping down tables in the back section when she noticed them being seated in her area. At 32, she had worked at La Rosa d'Oro for 3 years, long enough to recognize wealth when she saw it, and long enough to know that money didn't always translate to decency. She smoothed her black apron, tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear, and approached their table with the practiced smile she'd perfected through countless shifts. "Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to La Rosa d'Oro," she said, her voice steady and professional. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" Marcus barely glanced up from his menu. "Scotch, 25-year-old. You do have good Scotch here, don't you?" His tone carried an edge, as if the question itself was a challenge. "Of course, sir. We have Macallan, Glenfiddich. Just bring the most expensive one," Bradley interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "And water, sparkling, Italian, obviously." Jonathan finally looked up from his phone, his eyes scanning Lisa with an unsettling combination of appraisal and dismissal. "Wine list. The real one, not whatever you show tourists." Lisa maintained her composure, though her jaw tightened imperceptibly. "I'll bring that right away." She turned toward the bar, her mind already cataloguing the interaction. These weren't just wealthy men. They were the kind who wielded their status like a weapon, testing boundaries to see who would bend. The restaurant hummed with quiet conversation and the clink of silverware against porcelain. Other servers moved gracefully between tables, while the open kitchen in the back revealed chefs working over flames, tossing pasta in copper pans. The scent of garlic, basil, and fresh-baked bread permeated the air, mingling with expensive cologne and the faint smokiness from the wood-fired oven. When Lisa returned with their drinks, the men had shed their initial restraint. Marcus was leaning back in his chair, discussing a real estate deal in Lincoln Park with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to reshaping neighborhoods according to his vision. Bradley laughed too loudly at something on his phone, while Jonathan swirled wine in his glass, critiquing its provenance before even tasting it. "Ready to order?" Lisa asked, pen poised over her notepad. "The osso buco," Marcus said without looking at her. "And tell the chef not to overcook it. Last time I had this dish somewhere, it was leather." "You've never been here before?" Lisa pointed out gently, immediately regretting the clarification. Marcus's eyes snapped to hers, cold and assessing. "Are you correcting me?" "No, sir. I just meant—" "Then don't," he said flatly. Bradley ordered the branzino with specific modifications that would require the kitchen to essentially prepare a different dish. Jonathan requested the bistecca fiorentina, adding that it should be prepared properly, not how Americans usually ruin it. Lisa wrote everything down, her professional mask firmly in place. "I'll have that out for you shortly." As she walked away, she heard Bradley's voice, not quite whispered, "Did you see her face? Like we're supposed to be grateful she's gracing us with her service." Quiet laughter followed. Lisa's hands trembled slightly as she entered the order into the system, but she forced herself to breathe slowly, evenly. She'd dealt with difficult customers before. This would be no different. Except it was different. Something in the air felt charged, volatile. Perhaps it was the way Marcus kept watching the room, as if calculating the value of everyone in it. Or how Bradley's jokes grew cruder as he drank. Or Jonathan's phone calls, conducted in hushed tones with barely concealed aggression. In the kitchen, Chef Antonio noticed Lisa's expression. "Problemi?" he asked in his Sicilian accented English. "Table 12. Just difficult," she replied, managing a tight smile. Antonio nodded knowingly. "Some men, they forget their mothers taught them manners. You need something, you tell me." The orders went out perfectly. Osso buco falling off the bone, branzino glistening with olive oil and herbs, bistecca sliced to reveal a perfect medium-rare center. Lisa delivered each plate with careful precision, explaining the dishes as she'd been trained, only to be met with dismissive nods and returned attention to phones and conversation. They ate with the mechanical efficiency of men for whom fine dining was routine rather than special. Occasionally, one would make a comment about the food, never to Lisa directly, always to each other, always with an undertone of criticism. The wine was acceptable, the bread was adequate, the ambiance was trying too hard. As the evening progressed, the restaurant filled with other diners, couples celebrating anniversaries, business associates closing deals, families gathering for birthdays. The contrast between their tables and table 12 grew more pronounced. Where others laughed genuinely and thanked their servers, Marcus, Bradley, and Jonathan seemed to exist in a bubble of entitled dissatisfaction. Lisa refilled water glasses, cleared plates, offered dessert menus. Each interaction was met with the same cool dismissal, as if she were merely a fixture of the restaurant, no more worthy of acknowledgement than the chairs they sat on. What she didn't notice, what none of them noticed yet, was the man seated alone in the corner booth near the kitchen. Vito Romano had been there since before they arrived, eating slowly, reading a leather-bound book, occasionally glancing up to observe his restaurant with the quiet attention of someone who missed nothing. His silver hair was combed back neatly, his dark suit impeccable but understated. To casual observers, he might have been just another well-dressed patron enjoying a solitary meal. But to those who knew, to Chef Antonio, to the hostess, to the long-time servers, Vito Romano was the reason La Rosadoro existed. He'd opened it 30 years ago as a legitimate business, a way to honor his mother's recipes and create something beautiful in a world that often demanded ugliness. That he had other interests, other affiliations, was known but never discussed openly. And tonight, he was watching Table 12 with increasing interest. Marcus Whitfield's day had begun 16 hours earlier in a glass-walled office on the 47th floor of the Willis Tower, where Chicago sprawled beneath him like a game board awaiting his next move. At 53, he'd built an empire from calculated risks and ruthless negotiations, transforming struggling neighborhoods into luxury developments that displaced long-time residents and attracted wealthy transplants. His company, Whitfield Properties, had become synonymous with gentrification, though he preferred terms like urban renewal and economic revitalization. What few people knew, what Marcus worked meticulously to conceal, was that his empire stood on increasingly unstable ground. 3 years ago, he'd overextended on a development project in Pilsen, convinced that the neighborhood's artistic community would be easily displaced by high-end condos and boutique shops. But residents had fought back with organizing, protests and legal challenges that tied up permits and drained resources. The project sat half-finished, hemorrhaging money monthly, held together by a complex web of loans from banks that were growing impatient. This morning, his CFO had delivered news that made Marcus's carefully constructed confidence waver. They were 3 months from insolvency unless they closed the Streeterville deal, a waterfront property currently occupied by small businesses, including a family-owned grocery that refused to sell. The owner, an elderly Polish immigrant named Mrs. Kowalski, had rejected every offer, every threat, every legal maneuver, and time was running out. Bradley Sutton, seated across from Marcus at La Rosa d'Oro, carried his own concealed desperation. At 47, he'd built his reputation as a corporate lawyer who won cases through aggressive tactics and creative interpretation of regulations. His client list read like a roster of Chicago's most controversial developers and investors, men who needed legal protection for ventures that existed in ethical gray zones. But Bradley's success came at a cost he was only beginning to recognize. His third marriage was disintegrating, his wife having discovered not just the affairs, but the offshore accounts where he'd hidden assets from previous divorces. His teenage daughter from his first marriage hadn't spoken to him in 2 years. And last month, he'd received a letter from the Illinois State Bar Association regarding ethical complaints filed by opposing counsel in 3 separate cases. He'd come to dinner tonight not just for business networking, but to escape the emptiness of his Lincoln Park townhouse, where silence had become accusatory. The scotch helped dull the edge of his thoughts, as did the casual cruelty toward service staff, small exercises of power that temporarily filled the void where self-respect used to reside. Jonathan Pierce, the youngest of the 3 at 42, presented himself as a venture capitalist with interests in tech startups and medical innovations. The reality was more complicated. His fund managed money for investors whose sources of wealth often didn't bear close examination: Russian oligarchs, Saudi princes, Chinese businessmen with Communist Party connections. Jonathan specialized in making questionable money look legitimate, parking it in American real estate and startups that existed more on paper than in reality. 6 months ago, federal investigators had begun asking questions about one of his funds. Nothing formal yet, just preliminary inquiries that his lawyers assured him were routine. But Jonathan understood the trajectory of these things, the initial questions, the expanding investigation, the morning raid with agents carrying boxes from offices. He'd watched it happen to colleagues. His phone calls during dinner were to contacts overseas, quietly moving assets, creating distance between himself and transactions that might become problematic. All 3 men were, in their own ways, drowning, and drowning men often lash out, seeking to establish dominance wherever they can find it, even in interactions as mundane as dinner service. Meanwhile, in a small apartment in Bridgeport, the neighborhood where Lisa had grown up and still lived, her mother was reading a bedtime story to 7-year-old Emma. The apartment was clean but worn, second-hand furniture arranged with care, walls decorated with Emma's crayon drawings, a small kitchen where Lisa prepared meals late at night after her shifts ended. Lisa's story was simpler than the men's, but no less weighted with consequence. She'd gotten pregnant at 24 with a man who promised forever and delivered 6 months before disappearing. For 8 years, she'd built a life around her daughter, working double shifts when necessary, accepting the least desirable schedules, enduring whatever disrespect came with the territory because the tips at La Rosa d'Oro were better than anywhere else she'd worked. She had dreams beyond serving tables. At night, after Emma slept, Lisa took online courses toward a business degree, building toward a future where she might manage a restaurant rather than just work in one. She'd saved $3,000 toward that goal, a sum that felt simultaneously substantial and impossibly insufficient. Tonight's shift was supposed to be straightforward. In worker section, out by 11. Home to relieve her mother who watched Emma during evening shifts. But Table 12 had already extended her timeline, their demands and modifications creating extra work that delayed her other tables. And now, as they finished their entrees and Lisa delivered dessert menus, she could sense the evening taking a turn toward something darker. "Tiramisu, gentlemen, or perhaps the panna cotta," she offered, her voice maintaining its professional warmth despite the exhaustion creeping into her shoulders. Marcus pushed his plate away with a gesture that communicated both dismissal and disdain. "Everything here is overpriced. The osso buco was acceptable at best, certainly not worth what you're charging." Lisa kept her expression neutral. "I'm sorry it didn't meet your expectations, sir. Would you like me to speak with the chef?" "What I'd like," Marcus said, leaning back and fixing her with a cold stare, "is for this place to understand that reputation matters. A restaurant is only as good as its last meal, and tonight was thoroughly mediocre." Bradley laughed, emboldened by his fourth scotch. "Mediocre is generous. I've had better Italian at chain restaurants." Jonathan set down his wineglass with deliberate precision. "The real question is whether mediocre service deserves mediocre compensation." Lisa's stomach tightened. She'd navigated this conversation before, though never with quite this much edge. "I assure you, gentlemen, if there was something specific—" "There's always something specific," Marcus interrupted. "The water wasn't cold enough. The wine took too long. Your recommendations were presumptuous. Should I continue?" Each complaint was invented or exaggerated, and Lisa knew it. But she also knew the calculus of her position. She needed this job, needed the income, needed to avoid conflict that might jeopardize her standing with management. So she did what she'd learned to do. She absorbed it. "I apologize if any aspect of your experience was unsatisfactory," she said carefully. "Let me see if there's something we can do to make this right." "What you can do," Jonathan said, his voice taking on a challenging tone, "is bring the check, and then we'll discuss what we think this meal was actually worth." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Lisa felt her professionalism beginning to crack, felt the anger she usually suppressed rising up from a place deeper than tactical restraint. But she swallowed it down, nodded, and walked toward the service station to print their bill. Behind the bar, Marco, another server who'd worked at La Rosadoro for 5 years, noticed her expression. "Those guys giving you trouble." "Nothing I can't handle," Lisa said automatically, though her hands shook slightly as she ran their check. The total came to $378, reasonable for what they'd ordered, though she knew they'd find it objectionable regardless. What neither Lisa nor the 3 men at Table 12 realized was that every moment of their interaction had been observed by Vito Romano, who'd long ago developed the ability to read situations before they fully unfolded. He'd watched Marcus's aggressive posturing, Bradley's escalating intoxication, Jonathan's calculated cruelty. He'd seen Lisa's restraint, her professionalism in the face of provocation, and he'd begun to recognize something familiar in Marcus Whitfield's face, a resemblance to someone from years past, a connection that made this situation more than just another instance of wealthy men behaving badly. But Vito was a patient man. He would wait to see how this unfolded before deciding whether to intervene. For now, he simply turned another page of his book and took a sip of espresso, his presence in the corner booth as steady and unavoidable as gravity. Lisa approached Table 12 with the check presenter, her professional demeanor firmly in place despite the dread pooling in her stomach. The restaurant had reached its evening peak, every table occupied, the ambient noise of conversation and laughter creating a warm atmosphere that stood in stark contrast to the cold tension radiating from the 3 men. "Here's your check, gentlemen," she said, placing the leather folder on the table between them. "Thank you for dining with us this evening." Marcus opened it, with deliberate slowness, his eyes scanning the itemized list, as if searching for evidence in a criminal investigation. His jaw tightened. $378. Yes, sir. Plus automatic gratuity of 20% for parties of 3 or more, as noted on the menu. The air seemed to crystallize around the table. Bradley leaned forward, his face flushed from scotch and indignation. Automatic gratuity? For what exactly? It's restaurant policy, sir, for all tables. Policy, Jonathan repeated, his voice dripping with derision. And what if the service doesn't warrant 20%? What if it doesn't warrant anything at all? Lisa felt her pulse quicken. If there was an issue with service, I'm happy to get the manager. The issue, Marcus interrupted, his voice rising enough to draw glances from neighboring tables, is that everything about this experience has been subpar. The food was mediocre, the ambiance tries too hard, and your service... He paused, looking her up and down with undisguised contempt. Your service consisted of taking orders and bringing plates. A trained monkey could do that. The words landed like a slap. Lisa felt heat rising in her face, a combination of humiliation and rage that made her vision narrow. Around them, conversations at other tables had begun to quiet, as diners sensed the confrontation unfolding. Sir, I understand you're unhappy, but unhappy. Bradley barked a laugh. Unhappy is an understatement. What we are is tired of places like this, overpriced, overhyped establishments that think they can coast on reputation while delivering garbage. Marco had noticed the escalating situation and was moving toward the manager's office, but Lisa stood frozen in place, watching as years of suppressed frustration and disrespect seemed to coalesce in this single moment. She thought of the double shifts, the late rent payments she'd juggled, the times Emma had cried because Mommy had to work weekends. She thought of every dismissive gesture, every customer who treated her as invisible, every compromise she'd made to keep this job. I'm going to get my manager, she said quietly, turning to leave. Don't bother, Marcus said, pulling out his wallet. Here's what this experience was worth. He placed $200 on the table, barely more than half the bill, with nothing for tip. That's generous considering. Lisa stared at the money, then at Marcus. The bill is $378 before tip. Then you have a problem, Jonathan said coolly, because that's all you're getting from us. The statement hung in the air, a line crossed that transformed the interaction from difficult customer to deliberate theft. Other servers had gathered near the bar, watching. The hostess had frozen at her stand. Even the kitchen had gone quiet, Chef Antonio emerging to observe the scene. You can't do that, Lisa said, her voice shakier now. You ordered the food. You ate it. You have to pay for it. Bradley stood up, his considerable height meant to intimidate. Or what? You'll call the police? Have us arrested? He laughed, looking around at the watching crowd. We're 3 successful businessmen. You're a waitress. Who do you think they'll believe? The cruelty of it, the naked exercise of power and privilege, rippled through the restaurant like a stone dropped in still water. Some diners looked away, uncomfortable witnesses to an injustice they didn't want to acknowledge. Others whispered to their companions, phones discreetly emerging to record the confrontation. Lisa felt tears threatening, but refused to let them fall. I'll have to pay the difference out of my pocket. That's $200. I can't... Her voice broke. I have a daughter. Not my problem, Marcus said, standing as well. Jonathan followed suit, the 3 of them preparing to leave as if the matter was settled, as if their departure was inevitable and unstoppable. That's when the voice came from the corner booth, quiet, but carrying an authority that made everyone freeze. Gentlemen, I think you should sit back down. All heads turned toward Vito Romano, who was carefully placing a bookmark in his leather-bound volume, setting it aside with the same measured deliberation he applied to everything. He stood slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced ease, his movements economical and purposeful. Marcus turned, irritation flashing across his face. "Excuse me? This is none of your business, friend." "Actually," Vito said, walking toward them with the relaxed confidence of a man who'd never had to prove himself through bluster, "it is very much my business. You see, I own this restaurant." The revelation shifted the dynamic instantly. Bradley and Jonathan exchanged glances, recalculating. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he held his ground. "Then you should know your prices are inflated and your staff is presumptuous." Vito stopped a few feet from table 12, close enough that the three men had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. In the golden light of the restaurant, his features were sharp and patrician, his silver hair catching the glow from vintage fixtures. But it was his eyes that held them, dark, assessing, containing depths that suggested he'd seen and done things that existed far beyond their comfortable world of contracts and corporate law. "My staff," Vito said softly, "is excellent. Lisa has worked here for 3 years. She's never been late. She's never been rude to a customer, even when customers have been—" He paused, letting the word hang. "Extraordinarily rude to her." "Look," Jonathan started, his venture capitalist instincts recognizing danger and seeking to negotiate. "We're willing to pay a reasonable amount for what was a reasonable meal, but $378 is excessive." Vito smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You ordered the osso buco, which takes 6 hours to prepare. You ordered the branzino, flown in fresh this morning from Greece. You ordered the bistecca fiorentina, a 22-ounce porterhouse from a specific farm in Iowa. You drank a bottle of Brunello that costs more than Lisa makes in 2 shifts. And now you want to decide, after consuming everything, that it wasn't worth paying for." "It's called customer discretion," Marcus said, trying to reclaim authority through volume. "If we're unsatisfied—" "You're not unsatisfied," Vito interrupted, his voice never rising but somehow filling the space more completely than Marcus's bluster. "You're playing a game you play because you can, because you've learned that most people will back down rather than confront you, because you've spent your lives believing that money and position place you above consequence." The restaurant had gone completely silent. Every diner, every server, every person in the space was watching the confrontation unfold with held breath. Bradley tried to inject reason into his voice. "Mr. Romano, is it? We're all businessmen here. Surely we can come to an understanding." "I understand perfectly," Vito said. "You came into my restaurant, you ate my food, you disrespected my employee, and now you think you can walk out without paying because—" He trailed off, looking at each of them in turn. "Why, exactly? Because you're important, because you're wealthy, because no one has ever told you no." The questions weren't rhetorical. They hung in the air like indictments. Marcus felt his face reddening, not just from anger, but from something unfamiliar: shame. Bradley looked toward the door, calculating whether they could simply leave. Jonathan had gone very still, his investor's instincts recognizing that Vito Romano represented a category of problem that couldn't be negotiated or litigated away. "Pay your bill," Vito said quietly. "All of it, including an appropriate tip for the server you attempted to humiliate, and then we'll discuss whether you're welcome to return." The standoff stretched for a long moment. The 3 men stood clustered together, their earlier confidence eroded by Vito's calm certainty. Around them, the restaurant waited, a collective breath held in anticipation of what would happen next. And in that silence, something shifted, not just in the immediate confrontation, but in the deeper currents that connected these people in ways none of them yet understood.